Lammy, long time no see. We've been on adventures and had weeks apart since we last talked. How are you?
I'm great. I had a really, really nice time away. Really reminded me how much I love traveling, and it felt like the first real vacation I've had as an adult. So good times. How about you?
Yeah, good. Traveling as well, traveling with a kid, which is a different new experience. But I think when you lower your expectations with a child, you can actually enjoy it more than maybe you would even normally when you have all these vaunted ideas in your mind and dreams of what you're going to do, and you want to accomplish 30,000 things in one day. And you end up, it's raining and you are in a long line for something. But when you're traveling with a kid, at least when we did very little. We did a lot of walking around, sitting at restaurants, and because our expectations were so low, we met them and exceeded them, which was a really nice feeling. So it was great. We went to Germany for a week, and now we're in Vancouver for the last day. It's been beautiful here. Yeah, I asked you before about travel, and this is maybe just for the beginning of our conversation, just because it's occurring to me now, if you play games while you travel. But another question about this is: does traveling inspire you creatively? For me, certainly as a writer or as a dreamer of worlds, a world builder, I get inspiration all the time when I'm walking down a street in another country, whether it's architecture, the way people move, the things that people do when they're sitting in a restaurant that's different from what I'm used to, or the scenery, the landscapes. I can be inspired by that. Does traveling inspire your imagination, your creativity, whether in a work environment or just personally for your own imagination?
Maybe if I engaged in any sort of creative arts things, it might. I know I had a friend who recently visited Italy just to get inspired to write some poetry. And I know that where we were in Portugal, in Sintra, at some of the palaces there, actually a lot of poets were inspired and wrote a lot of poetry about the region. Byron famously wrote a very long piece about the place we were at, and it was quite interesting to see. And um, I think this time around, with some of the things I saw, rather than specifically, I guess, inspiring me creatively directly, I just don't think it would apply really in any in my line of work or even what I do in my hobbies. There aren't really things that it applies for exactly, but it definitely gave me a lot of nostalgia and reminded me a lot of childhood. It was in these beautiful romantic style English gardens that felt like every child's dream, interconnected paths, just so many places to play and get lost and discover and find. And you definitely felt like behind any turn, there might be like a whole secret world. And that's something that you don't get a lot of in a lot of what I've seen growing up here. But in these old gardens, it's kind of amazing that they actually let you walk around. There was one area specifically that was completely pitch black labyrinth grotto. So underground caves, there was water and it's pitch black and they did not light it up and they let people go and explore. And it definitely sparked that sense of wonder and childlike, wow, like this is everything I would have dreamt of. And I get to experience it now. So in that sense, I had some, excitement, but I don't know that it really applies to anything that I'm going to create myself. I think a lot of my creativity, I really enjoy making things in terms of like a lot of woodworking or projects around the house. And I think I'm already fairly set in my inspirations for that. I get a lot of that, not really from travels, but rather from other people that I see doing interesting things. But I know, yeah, a lot for writers, for artists, painters, and all that. I think travel can be quite an inspiring and creative adventure.
Yeah, it can inspire in multiple ways, but there's really two sides of the coin really. There's the direct inspiration, but there's also taking a break from your normal routine, like almost like having a shower, or swimming in a pool or having or going for exercise to give your mind a break to refocus when it comes back, and that can be an inspiration. But there's also just direct inspiration that, oh, I like the way that that looks, I want to mimic that in the poem I'm writing or the architecture that I'm designing or whatever it is. What you say about the secret path or the hidden mysteries behind things, it reminds me of Ireland, actually. And I don't know if it's like this anymore because I was there 14 years ago, and I couldn't believe how many times I stumbled on an old ruin of an abbey or a castle or some tower from 800 years ago or 500 years ago. And they were just lying there in the middle of a field with cows going through it. And you could just walk up to it. There was no sign, no fence, no gate. You just walk up, wander around, and there was also no information about it unless you looked it up. And this was kind of not pre-internet, but pre-cell phone, certainly on a tourist like me. And so I would go into a ruin and have to look it up later. But while I was there, I had to imagine, what could this have been? Where am I standing right now? How old might this be? Which is more interesting than if I could just pull up my phone and Google it and, oh, this is what this is. It's not to say that that's not important to know what things are, but to have a moment of the unknown, the mystery. And there's another thing here about architecture, especially for gardens, English gardens versus French gardens or continental gardens, right? The famous palaces of Versailles. Or I remember going to, I think it's not the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, but it's the other one. I think the Palace of Peter or something, which is just this massive open-ended garden. And from the top, you can see everything. So it's almost a compilation of vantage points to see everything around you. Whereas an English garden is much more organic, almost like English city streets. They wind and they turn and they twist and they curve, and you don't really know where they're going, yet they're quite natural and organic. And if you just follow them, it makes sense in an unexpected sort of way. Whereas, the way Paris is designed, everything is on a map, it's straight lines and angles going into major intersections, which seems to make sense. But when you're there, it's very easy to get lost. It's not organic in the same way. I'm not asking this for this reason, but I wonder if there's a corollary there with designing a game. If you're designing a game that looks perfect from a distance, but that might actually interfere with someone's organic playing of the game, as opposed to just giving them a more visceral, inherent experience where they have to use their instincts, which from a distance, from a 30,000-foot view perspective, might look like a complete mess. And how do you even start designing games like that anyways?
Just quickly on that sort of road getting around and getting lost, we spent quite a bit of time in Portugal, and we were in Porto for quite a bit of it, which is, quite hilly. And Portugal seems to also have these winding streets that you don't really know where they're going. But the other thing that was really crazy to me about Porto is a lot of the streets might be stairs leading to different levels, essentially, right next to each other. And it was often really, really difficult to know when you were going somewhere exactly how you would get there, because elevation started playing a big aspect. So even if you had a Google map or something open, you didn't actually know exactly where you were going because you couldn't tell what elevation you would be on. And you would have all these streets laid out, and they might look like, okay, they connect in a certain way, and you might think you understand how they connect. And you see what looks like a road, and it's actually just a set of stairs that seems to go in this tiny little narrowest street you've ever seen. Like, how is this considered a street? We had a situation where we were trying to get across to the south side of Porto, across the river. And, we kept following, and we really didn't want to trust Google because it was taking us down and down and down. And we were supposed to be heading towards this bridge. We're going, there's no way, the bridge is up on the upper level. We've crossed it before. Like, this isn't going to take us there. Are we going to have to go all the way back up all these stairs? We kept trying to scout ahead. I was actually with my very elderly grandparents, and my biggest worry was we don't want them climbing all these stairs again. But it turns out that bridge also has a lower level. Literally, the bridge is 2 levels. There's the one that's above, and then right at water level, a tiny little footbridge. And that is exactly the kind of thing that kept happening to us in Porto, where we kept finding weird paths and ways to get around places that we never would have thought. And oftentimes going in circles. and taking so long to get somewhere and ending up 2 feet from where we'd started, but on like maybe a totally different plane. And we didn't know that it was that close if we had just gone the other way. And I think about that with games and with maps, and especially with things like Metroidvanias, where you have your games that unlock, the quick passageway once you get through it the long way, and you're like, wow, that was right there. I was literally around the corner from, where I would have been. I just couldn't get through because I didn't have this door open, or all of that. And how you can create such a big world with elevation by adding, different elevations that might actually be on the same map. And it's a way that you could definitely expand a world that otherwise might seem physically very small.
Well, let's talk about geography for a second and how a game is designed to immerse you in a world that is not just three-dimensional, but architecturally interesting. So Tokyo is another example of a city, because of its density, not just its history, that can feel like there are so many levels above and below you. If you're in the middle of an intersection in central Tokyo, there might be two or three rail lines below you. You're on a pedestrian path. There's a highway above you and another road above you. And it's all as part of this massive mall-like complex. And there are sculptures everywhere. And it looks like whatever level you're on could probably be ground level or at the top of a tower, because you're contained within this other atmosphere. And I found that fascinating. And it contained, like you said before, many hidden passages or many opportunities for something secret. That right around that corner might be something I could explore. And I think that that's something really exciting about games, is this offering through geography of interesting things to explore. When I'm playing a game, I sometimes rely a bit much on the map, whether it's the map in the top right corner or the map when you press the M key or whatever, to know where I am and so that I don't have to kind of memorize my surroundings. And sometimes I feel like I'm losing the experience. So one game that we've talked about many times, and we'll actually have an episode on, Outer Wilds, that's a game where I'm desperate to have a mental map of the game in my head, to know where the planets are, where the things I have to do are, and when I'm on a planet, generally which direction things are. Because that's part of the exploration. It's a spatial awareness exploration game, not just an exploration of the things that are going on, at least for me. But I feel like I need to play it enough to have that experience. And so because I'm only revisiting this game for a few hours every couple of weeks or something, I feel like I'm defaulting to the map and not feeling totally immersed in the world. Whereas if I get dropped in a city in Europe somewhere for a day, I remember the first time I went to Naples, I was there for 3 hours. And I remember getting a really clear understanding of the city because I had no choice. I just went into the city, I wandered around, and I had to figure it out. And that made my experience of that city more interesting. To what extent do you rely on the map or try to be independent of the map when you're playing games with that kind of spatial discovery and exploration?
Rasputin just put out a video about mini maps recently. I don't know if you saw that one. Um, I think it may be his most recent video. So, and I do kind of agree with him, which he talks about how mini maps can, depending on the genre of video game, really detract from your experience if you're spending all your time staring at the mini map rather than engaging with what's around you. And I think that in gaming and in the real world, I feel like I'm often too reliant on maps. I used to have, when I was younger and there were no phones and no Google Maps to help get you around, you just kind of had to learn. And, GPS and all of these things, I feel like sometimes make it harder for you to know yourself and get a spatial awareness of where you are because you're just following what you're being told. And I do think that I can rely on maps too much in games, but, you know, I'm not as likely if it's hidden behind a button. So if I have to click M all the time, I probably won't use it too much. But if it's sort of a HUD or an overlay, then I can definitely find myself using it more often than I should. In Breath of the Wild, I really thought that they did the HUD for that reason very, very well, because you can really eliminate practically all HUD elements. and just wander around. And I felt that that was a really good way for me to get lost, but also start to figure out the relationships between different spatial places. And mini maps, I do kind of agree. They should really only be used, or overlays or things like that should only be used where they provide peripheral sort of information that you maybe can use just very, you don't need to have your eye on it. Um, or in games where, then if you're spending all your time looking at the mini map, it's actually okay because you don't care that much about what else is going on. So I don't know. I think it is an issue, and I think people do tend to kind of ruin their own experiences that way. So making sure that the map, for example, you could have a map, but not have every single point of interest with a nice little line guiding you perfectly how to get there, kind of like the GPS example. Um, Again, I think Breath of the Wild is probably a really good example of how to handle it, where you do need the maps in certain times when you're being told or you want to know how to, like, where something is. But most of the time, you're just kind of invited to really, really be in the world. And there are ways to essentially eliminate anything else on your screen but just the world in front of you. And I found that very, very pleasant, and that the intentionality of what was presented and what was available to you made the game feel, I think, how the developers intended it to feel, is that you were out there exploring this vast world, and anything you saw you could get to. And it was a lot more of that over there, I'm curious, I want to go there, as opposed to the way we often play an RPG, which is I've been told I need to get to this quest marker, so I'm going to go to that quest marker.
It's kind of technical, but do you think that the size of the screen matters in this question? Like, I'm thinking I always play on, I have a laptop, really, and that's all I've got. I don't really play games on my phone, but I guess I could, and that's all I really have access to. And so to be truly immersed in the geography of the world, I've got to get pretty close to the screen, and it's going to get tiring after a while. It's not like sitting in a movie theater or having a large screen TV on the wall or something where I can feel almost lost in it. And so I suspect that it would matter for me if I had a bigger screen. I might have an easier time getting lost in the geography rather than just what I normally do, which is to use the terrain as just a way to get to where I'm going. I've just got to get through this, and so I get frustrated when I don't know where I am or when the mini map is confusing. Larian's games, so Divinity Original Sin 2 recently, or Baldur's Gate 3. It's sometimes hard to know where the hell you are, and there's a lot of stuff that's hidden in the natural environment. And you have to explore to find it. It's not going to give it away on the map. Whereas the old Infinity Engine games, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 and Icewind Dale, you could have really clear delineations of where the rooms on the map are, and there's going to be nothing beyond it, so don't bother. And there's kind of, not secrets, but a code from the developer to the player that says you don't need to go over here, so don't waste your time, because exploration in that game is handled in such a way of, we know you are going to spend many hours in here, so we're going to try to focus your efforts in this direction so you don't feel like you're wasting your time and just giving up and closing the screen. But do you think that screen size, to go back to that, has any effect?
It probably does, but I would say that it's more on the developer to develop an engaging experience, kind of regardless of screen size. So I could imagine a game that is really detailed and maybe has a lot of like natural elements, or like just has a lot of visual clutter, that it's probably a lot more engaging with a larger screen. Like, you need the resolution to be able to tell that clutter apart, visual clutter apart. But I could imagine games, right? Like, and they've made games like this where you're actually very tunnel visioned. Like, they don't give you a lot of option of things to see. There are games that are made in retro style that are very small screens on purpose, and they were designed with that in mind. And so the information presented is presented in such a way that you would still be able to focus on it. I typically find for myself, it actually doesn't matter that much. Kind of the same as with resolution, where at first I'll be like, oh, like that's really low resolution, or like, oh, that's really tiny. It really only takes a few minutes of playing for me to be completely lost, if the game is good and engaging, right? That's the if. So the developer like still needs to be able to provide that. If I'm absorbed in the game, it almost doesn't matter what I'm playing on. Like, I can't tell the number of times. And it's the same with watching something. We probably used to think, how could you ever watch something on a small phone? Like, oh, let's make phones bigger so we could see more. And then people were like, actually, we want smaller phones because, they'll fit in our pockets. And you totally can. You kind of just forget. I think you just get absorbed in the story or whatever the activity is. And I've definitely had this happen before where I've popped open a game on Steam and it's been in windowed mode and been like a quarter the size of my screen. And I started playing and realized later, oh shoot, it's not even full screen. Like I just got so interested in the game and I could have made it bigger and totally everything else melted away because I was so focused on just the visuals that were there. But again, I think maybe like depending on the graphics, definitely I think it could be an issue depending on the size that you play on. So whatever the developers probably made it and intended it for is going to be the best experience, rather than something either much larger, which could probably make certain games that have almost no visual interest at all kind of boring because you just have a lot of blank empty space if you have it blown up, or the opposite with a game that has a lot and you want to play it on something much smaller, you're just missing a lot of what's going on or just getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I wonder how a visual artist would respond to this. Making art for different sizes and different occupations of the eye. Like something that can be seen in the periphery, something that can be seen in one corner but it's focused in on, something that takes up a massive wall in an art gallery somewhere is going to have a different impact on people. But for someone who's interested in the art itself and who is maybe has a trained eye, well, they're going to walk up to the big piece and look at the brushstrokes, and they're going to zoom in on their phone, or they're going to analyze things differently. So I think a lot of gamers are probably in that boat where it doesn't really matter what the screen is, they're going to zoom in and they're going to find what they need to find. Again, as you say, as long as it's interesting. But there is a sense, I think, too, with geography of this balancing act between allowing your players to get lost in the world and finding themselves and keeping them on the rails, right? Keeping them focused on what they're going to do next. And yeah, so I guess that's an interesting question in terms of geography for you. Do you like to be guided? Like you said before, you can be a bit too reliant on maps. Do you like to be guided to what's going on, or do you like to be kind of thrown in there and said, hey, go and figure it out? Like, what's your preference?
I think I like to be thrown in and said, hey, go figure it out. I think we've talked before about the fact that I tend to want to follow the rules, at least in terms of, I don't want to purposefully do things that were clearly breaking what the developer intended. And so often if there's a rail provided, maybe I'll adhere to it too much. So the idea of just being like an open world and go explore, I said I really love exploration games. I think I'd actually prefer that because I wouldn't feel like, oh, I'm kind of doing something that I'm not supposed to be. In the same way, because I'm a completionist, I will always look for the secret passageways and the secret paths, even if it is on rails, but only because I expect the developer put that in there, right? If it's a clear, like that I'm doing, like trying to break something, I often won't necessarily try it, except for maybe a, kind of collegiate curiosity of did they actually code for this edge case. But yeah, I think I like the idea. I know a lot of people say that they feel aimless if they're not given a goal in a game, like if they're not guided. And I've heard that from people like, oh, I just didn't really know what to do. There were too many options, and I don't feel that way. It's something where I really like, and to me, there's like, I know why I'm playing a game. If for me the main motivations are exploration and completionist, like seeing and doing everything, I don't need the game to tell me, oh, this is the next quest that you need to do. I'm totally fine. Like I will solve the mysteries that the game presents to me. And I think I actually enjoy that kind of system more. Now, I still enjoy, like I enjoy the mechanics, like when, especially if it's like a tech tree or something like that. But I almost think that that's why I say I shouldn't be given too many rails, because I end up wanting to just focus on that and completing that as quickly as I can instead of kind of taking the time and just enjoying it. What about you?
Well, it just reminds me of, yeah, I'm similar to you. I sometimes want to complete the rails in order to get back to the exploration. So if I'm given 7 rails, it's almost like, okay, I'll finish. I'll get these out of the way so that I can go back to feeling like I'm just in this world. And again, like you, I'm not looking for the edge cases. I'm looking for where I should be looking. And I don't want to, it's not competitive. I don't want to find things before other people do. I want to feel the sense of newness, of when you discover something behind a door and you don't know what to expect, and how do you react to that in the first time that it happens? So a game can be mundane or boring when you've gone through the door and you've got to overcome an obstacle and it's taken you 8 hours to do because it's really difficult. Not 8 hours, but whatever it is. Eventually that becomes boring because the newness has been taken out. And there's some games that work well with that situation by giving you mechanical choices you can make, gameplay choices to overcome the obstacle, so that the freshness is in trying a new strategy as opposed to opening a new door that you haven't tried yet. And I think probably the games that I like are a mix of the two. But if there's if there's too many doors that I have to open, that can be exhausting too. Like I like being dropped in and go figure this out, almost creating the meaning for myself. But if I feel like if the blank space is just endless, and I got to go into another room and another room and another hallway, I don't know. I'm gonna get bored of that. I want to feel like there's a reason that I'm here, and that there's a certain amount of time I have to spend here, which can be truncated if I'm good to get to the next bit. But there's got to be that reward dangling of the next bit that's in front of me, I think. Yeah.
I think if it's too much similar, coming back a little bit to geography, if opening all the doors just opens another room that looked just like the last one, then yeah, I would lose interest. But if even if there was just door after door and room after room, but if there was something, visually different about each of them, or, you did find a new piece of lore or whatever it is, right? Even if they don't tell me that to, behind the fifth door, there's a particular item or something, but just I'm discovering things as I open them. I think that's fine. It gets exhausting when it feels empty, when the worlds of these games feel empty and there's just a lot of the sameness without something to achieve in them. And I know, coming back to Breath of the Wild, people complained a little bit about that with Breath of the Wild, that the world felt a little empty and a little samey. And I can see where people are coming from, but I never really felt it so strongly. It didn't detract from my enjoyment of the game. There was always something like, oh, like that mountain over there, I want to get to it. Or, oh, I see like there's some sort of dungeon over here that I want to try out. And yeah, there'd be dungeons in other places, but nothing was quite exactly the same. And there was enough, even in the sparseness of it. But also, I think the sparseness was intentional. The game is meant to be, this post-apocalyptic sort of feel. The music is very sparse, which people also complained about. But to me, that was clearly a design choice. They wanted a feeling of loneliness and, emptiness in this world. And I think they achieved it. And I think it worked. And that not everything needs to be, I think, again, people are so used to how busy these mini maps are, like you were talking about, like there's just so much. They're used to seeing a mini map with a million markers on it. And here was this game where the mini map had no markers unless you put a marker down. And a lot of stuff was just open. And I kind of took it as a meditative experience. Like it was just, I enjoyed it. I don't know. It felt, it's called Breath of the Wild, but it did feel like a breath of fresh air. You were outdoors. And it's weird to say that playing a video game, it kind of felt like being out in nature, but it did, scratch that itch. So I don't know, there's ways you could do it, but I do think there has to be something there, right? If it's a lot of the same, you're not getting that newness, like you said. As long as there's new, even if it's not guided or railed new, that new is presented when you explore more or do whatever the action is of the game more.
Yeah, there's an interesting dilemma that I think developers must face, and here's an example of it. So, I've played CRPGs quite a bit. So Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and then more recently Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous and Pathfinder Kingmaker, which come before it. These are very similar games. They're historical high fantasy. To some extent, Pillars of Eternity is almost like Renaissance era, but really medieval fantasy, swords and shields and stuff like that. And I think it was in Pillars of Eternity where this started, which was almost not a remake, but a spiritual successor to the Baldur's Gate series and the Infinity Engine games, where they solved a problem of gaming by when you had a random encounter or a map where it was just a combat encounter. You're going to face this guy that's on the road, or you're collecting a bounty, so you're going to cross the world and you're going to go defeat this enemy. The map was going to be the same. It might be the Arctic version of the map or the desert version of the map, but it's very, very small. There's nothing on the map but a kind of an area for the battle to take place. And then when the battle's over, other than the loot that you gather from the enemies that you vanquish, there's nothing else to explore. There's no cave off to the side. There's no loot that's hidden in some tree somewhere. And it's a signal from the developers to the gamer, don't worry about it. Don't explore this. You've been here before. Move on. Don't waste your time here. So I remember when I first experienced this in Pillars of Eternity, I think it was 1, but it might have been 2. I thought, oh, this is so great. I remember feeling like a weight was lifted. When I was in one of these encounters, I didn't have to do all that crap. I could move on more quickly, right? Because sometimes it gets tedious. So I've got to look behind. I got to explore the whole map. I got to walk around to make sure that my perception check works everywhere. But when you just are told, essentially, without being told in so many words, don't worry about that. This is just for the battle. But by the time I've noticed this happening almost as a standard practice in these CRPGs now, that I'm in another battle, okay, and the map is the same. Even if it's slightly different, I know it's one of these small maps for the battle. It's immersion breaking. So it's solving the one problem, which is that I find exploration can be tedious when I'm in another map and it's exploration for exploration's sake, right? It's almost gratuitous. But when I'm no longer in a new place and I'm just in the same room over and over and over again, it doesn't just break the immersion, but it can become tedious in a different way. And so, I don't know really how to solve this problem. So another CRPG, like I just mentioned, the Larian games, Baldur's Gate 3 being the newest one, they don't have this. It's one massive map. There might be a cave that you go into, but it's a massive map, and you don't have a mini map here, or not a mini map, but like a smaller map here and there. But that has another problem, which is there's so much to explore. It's almost overabundant. I guess I don't really have a question here. It's just something that I've discovered in playing these games. By solving one problem, you're playing whack-a-mole. You're creating a new problem for yourself. And it might even be the same problem. By making it less tedious here, you just make it more tedious here. But it's also a performance issue too. By having the same map recur, the game doesn't have to reload so many different things, and it makes the speed of the game better. Yeah.
Well, I think we're both timing out today, so we'll go straight into what this conversation piqued my interest in, which is really continuing on a similar topic, but maybe speaking more in depth about environments and biomes in games, and continuing on this more directed idea of how games use and utilize setting and biomes and environments to their advantage or their disadvantage, as it may be.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's actually what I was going to suggest. I think there's a lot of fruit to be plucked from the tree here. There's a lot more to discuss. So, cool. Okay. Well, we'll see you next time.